We've been doing some very top level sort of ideas where it's a lot of theory. Let's take an actual example of some idea that we have and break it into a better architecture. After this lecture, we're going to be going over specific sort of patterns that you can use to build out architectures. But before we get to that, I wanted to just go over an example, break it apart without any of that knowledge in our heads so that we can understand that architecture does not have to fit the patterns. We can use anything that we want as long as it makes sense in the end for the project. So in this situation, what we have is we have this game app. It's on our phone. That's the sort of a stipulation with this. It's a game app on your phone. We've all played a game like this where, let's say it's something very basic, a side-scrolling game. So, we have the phone, and this phone is just playing the game, and it has maybe a user, it has a score system that maybe, works with Android score system. Let's say it's on an Android device. It's got a character. With that character, when he runs, we click a button or we just tap the bottom of the screen, the character jumps over something and then just keeps running. We have, some clouds and stuff in the background moving this way. Our character's going that way. We're trying to collect something, and that's overall the idea of the game. So how do we break this up from a singular file? Because right now that's all we have. We have this entire app running off of one single file. And so what do we do to break up the architecture? Well, with this, we're thinking very big, very sort of large sections of the app. We're not trying to design every single function and method call and data call. What we want to see is how is the app going to sort of interact within itself. And an idea or a good way to sort of start with this is to think about the game app and think about where the data is going. What data are we collecting? That's a good place to start. So maybe we have a user object. That's a good one that we typically have. What is a user? User is, a username, password. Maybe it has an ID with it so we can look up what scores we have on each levels. Maybe it has a progression associated with it. If we have level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we want to make sure that user, 115, if he makes it to level 700, that we keep track of that somehow. So we have a user data. Well, where do we typically keep the user? We could keep it on the phone itself, but the problem is if he or she moves the phone, then we're going to lose that progress. So that means we need to store it off-site, which means in a server. Okay, so that means we have at least a server element. So let's just put that over here. We have a server. So we have a server. That's something we're going to definitely use. And what else do we have? Well, we're looking at something on the phone, right? So we have to have some sort of idea or some sort of asset, something to make the motion work. So we have another idea here. We have the server that's going to store our data. We have the front end, maybe, sort of like the assets or the graphics. That's a good word. We have the graphics. And then how's the game actually all working out? How's it all working together? Well, we have something in the middle, right? Some sort of logic that's controlling the game. So a lot of times this is the game loop because it's running in a continual loop. Every frame, everything on the game updates. So we have sort of like this game loop in the center. Or we can also say that this is something like logic in the center. So now we've broken it up into a couple of different parts here, and we can continue to break these up, or maybe we have a different idea about how the game should work. Maybe with a server, we should also have something like local storage. Maybe that's a good idea. We should look into local storage. And so that's all we got to do. We have to just think about the app. What's it going to do? What are our ideas? Draw some stuff out, and then sort of write all this down. And then we can begin organizing it. So here what we have is I just designed it into 3 separate areas. We have the front end of the game, the graphics, the assets, everything you see. Then we have the game logic, and that's going to be the things controlling the game itself. When you click the button and the character jumps, the logic is going to then update whatever variable is inside, and it's going to then call back to the front end to make the character jump. It's going to keep track of the scores, of the progression. It's going to have the levels loaded into it. That's where the logic is. And then we also have the game server. That's where all of our information is going to be kept. We're going to have the scoreboard over here. We're going to have our user information. Maybe even we set it up in a way that we have on the game server levels. So instead of having to update the app itself, all we have to update is the server. That's a neat architecture idea that might save us a lot of time in the long run, because whenever you update the app itself, you end up having to put additional megabytes in it. You have to load the levels into the app. Instead of having to do that, we could have them contact a server to download the level they're on, and they'll delete it afterwards, making our app very streamlined. An idea there. So we have these two, and we have this sort of now architecture developing where we have this layer. So the front end of the game is going to connect to the game logic, and the game logic is going to connect to the server. At no point will the server touch the front end. At no point will the front end touch the server. We're always going to have this sort of buffer zone in the middle. And this is a typical sort of, we call it a model view controller, or sort of this class where we have this idea of this front end, this sort of intermediary end, which is that middle end, and then the back end, which stores all of our data. And so let's break this up and do even more. We can look at each one of these areas and think about how are they all going to work out. And instead of going through, we'll do the exact same thing where we think about it, we come up with different ideas, and then over time, this is what I sort of came up with. So we have the background of the game. That's that part in the background that, the user is never going to touch. The character is never actually going to jump on those blocks in the background. It's just sort of a continual movement of assets in the background. Then we have the foreground of the game. Those are the things the user are going to interact with. Those are the things that could kill the user. If the little guy that they're controlling touches one of them, then we're going to have to call some logic for that, etc. And then menus. If we're going to edit our account, if we're going to select a level, we need that as well. So let's say that the background of the game, we're going to have that. It's only going to really touch the graphics logic because it's not actually going to control anything. It's just going to be in the background. The foreground of the game, maybe it needs to touch the game control logic because the game control logic is actually going to be coming out and sort of controlling this. And then at the same time, it might be communicating with the graphic logic as well to update certain assets. And then with the game control logic, maybe that's the thing that's touching the score logic down here. We have the menus. The menus are probably going to have some connection to the database. The score is going to have some connection to the database because that's going to then sort of move backwards. Let's say that the score logic doesn't touch it directly. Maybe we want to separate these into two different ones in the center to make two different layers. The database logic will update both the databases in the background. And you can see we have to really think about the connections here. How's everything going to be working back and forth? And then we think about all this, and how I was talking about it's getting a little confusing because now we're having the center talk to only the center, and then it talks to the back end. It feels like we need another sort of layer in the center. So then we just think about it, and we come up with, okay, maybe we need some controllers here. So that means if we have the background of the game, it's going to touch the graphics controller, and from that, it's then going to decide what it should touch. So in this situation, it's only going to touch the background of the game. However, maybe the foreground is also going to go into the graphics controller, but it's going to touch the game logic and the graphic logic. And then the input controller, that'll be sort of, whenever we click on something on the front end, it'll touch the input controller. The input controller will then change the game logic, and then it'll go back and it'll update the foreground again. The progression controller, that's probably just going to be watching what's happening, and then with the progression, it's going to be going in and updating the score logic. The score logic will then be sent to the servers. If we go from a menu, maybe down here we have a user controller, and then from the menus, it touches the user controller, that touches the database, that goes up to our personal server, etc., etc. But as you can see, all we have to do is keep asking questions. We look at the way that we've separated it up until that point, and then we ask, what other areas are there? Does this make sense? Is there a way we could separate this even further? Is everything that's going to happen in this going to be sort of uniform? Is it all going to be together? Meaning, whenever we're talking about the front end, there are different aspects to the front end. So let's break it up into those different aspects and then look at each one of them and see if they can be broken up even more. With the menus, maybe we want to separate that into the levels. So levels over here, and maybe you want to separate one of them into settings if we're doing user settings, etc., etc. And that might be the next level of this. But overall, I just wanted to give you that sort of example here of us taking this idea and breaking it down into different architectures as we go through the idea.